If you look at the comparisons to this fight, Mosul 2016, that lasted 9 months and there was only 9,000 ISIS fighters. There's 40,000 Hamas fighters and they have 300 miles of tunnels. So it certainly is, if they intend to ultimately destroy Hamas, it will take at least that long, if they can do it even then.
Let me just start with what we've heard from Israel's defense minister tonight, saying that Hamas has lost control of northern Gaza. What do you see as the significance of that?
So I don't know if it's true, but if it is, I think what he means is they've essentially got to the command and control element of what they think is the command and control element of Hamas and dispersed it. So that doesn't mean the fighting over, because the fighting could last a long time, because most of these terrorist organizations are very capable of being cellular. So it's going to be a long slog in the tunnels fighting, but I assume he means they hit the main command and control of Hamas, likely in the center of Gaza City.
Yeah, indeed. Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, said that the army had made significant gains, but he also warned that this military offensive could last for what he described as long months. And I mean, that does mean that those that are still there, and although many civilians have clearly fled, there are some that have, for whatever reason, been unable to get out. There is going to be more of this terrible loss of life.
There absolutely is, unfortunately. If you look at the comparisons to this fight, Mosul 2016, that lasted 9 months and there was only 9,000 ISIS fighters. There's 40,000 Hamas fighters and they have 300 miles of tunnels. So it certainly is, if they intend to ultimately destroy Hamas, it will take at least that long, if they can do it even then. So I think that's a fair statement. Months, many months actually, would be what most would estimate, I think.
There's been a lot of focus on what's happening at the main hospital there, the Al-Shifa hospital. A doctor has said that around 200 patients have been buried in mass graves there. But we have now heard from the US that they have seen evidence to support Israel's claim that Hamas has some kind of a command and control center, some form of base underneath that hospital. What do you make of what we're hearing from the US on this?
So I do think it's possible, since the IDF was there before, that they left, and I don't have any information, it's just my speculation. But certainly I would have left some kind of stay-behind capability where I'd be able to monitor what was under the hospital. I believe the IDF was actually set up down there. So I think they know, and I think they have a very good understanding. The U.S. intelligence community either used that to make their assessment or had their own intelligence. But I don't think anybody should be surprised that Hamas is hiding under civilian infrastructure. They've been doing it the entire time. They've been telling civilians not to leave Gaza City, for example. And fortunately, many have. And hopefully more will take the opportunity when these tactical pauses come. But I do believe it's most likely that Hamas is using places that they know are going to be problematic. And many would normally be off limits to military operations if it wasn't for them being in those facilities, which then makes it a valid military target.
And we've had a statement in response from Hamas saying that these statements from the United States give a green light to the Israeli occupation to commit further brutal massacres targeting hospitals. And I mean, the scenes that we are seeing and hearing do seem to suggest that the situation at that hospital, and we heard from the leader of one of the aid agencies on this programme last night, describing how at that stage there were bodies lying in the street outside. We're now hearing that 200 patients have been buried in a mass grave. I mean, the humanitarian situation there, it is extremely serious.
It absolutely is, and that's a good point. Just because Hamas is in the hospital doesn't make the hospital itself nor the people in it that are innocent civilians valid military targets. So any military anywhere around the world has to abide by the international rules of armed conflict. And that means they have to distinguish friend from foe and use only the proportionality that's necessary to kill the enemy. Unfortunately, that does mean sometimes civilians are killed, but that has to be obviously not the intent of the military action, and they have to do everything they can to avoid it. So that is still the case. It's very difficult in urban environments. It's very difficult fighting an enemy who has total disregard for the civilian population, which I think Hamas has shown. But it's still the requirement of the IDF to do that. And hopefully we can get more and more people to go to the south where a safe haven can be set up and humanitarian aid can be disrupted going in there to the people who need it.
We've got both the British and the US governments saying that they don't support a ceasefire at this stage because they accept the argument that that would play into the hands of Hamas, that Israel does have a right to respond to those terrorist attacks of October the 7th. But there is quite a debate about it here in the UK. We've had a former Foreign Office minister on the programme saying that he now supports a ceasefire because he simply doesn't want to see more innocent children dying, and that is the only way to allow civilians to leave and to get significant amounts of humanitarian aid in. President Biden has said that Israel needs to act within international law. But do you think there is going to be more pressure on the American government too to say, look, we need a ceasefire if there is going to be any kind of move towards finding some peaceful solution to this?
So I do think there'll be growing pressure because this is not in any way over. There's going to be a lot more death and a lot more destruction. But if to distinguish a ceasefire from a tactical pause, which we're seeing almost daily, a ceasefire would be longer term, so many days, if not weeks, and it has to be bilateral. Pauses can be unilateral, meaning that the IDF could just do it. But a ceasefire means that the Hamas has to agree to it, and more than agree, has to actually adhere to it. So that is very problematic. The other part that I think is totally reasonable for the Israelis to ask for is that hostages be released for a ceasefire. I mean, after all, that is a crime in and of itself, and every day that it continues is further crime and atrocity against humanity. So I do think that is going to be something that's looked at. Now, there's a military side of this too. If it's a long, long ceasefire, then you have IDF troops that are in Gaza. Where are they going to go? They're going to try to strong point someplace. Is Hamas going to stay in place? Are they going to be maneuvered on? Is this going to be a constant breakdown? If they ask that they leave in a ceasefire, if they withdraw, then that puts their troops at great risk if they have to come back in and reoccupy the places that they've already cleared. So there's a political part of this. There's also a military practicality part of this. The IDF is nowhere near their objective, which is destroying Hamas. So if they pull out and don't come back in, then they're basically leave the situation without actually accomplishing the mission.
There has been talk of these 4-hour humanitarian pauses. Is it your understanding that Israel is actually holding those, that it is holding fire long enough to perhaps get at least some supplies in?
That is my understanding. We've seen hundreds of thousands, if not a million people leave the northern part of Gaza, some days up to 50,000 people. I think that's very important that they understand when these are going to happen, because they need to be able to get out at a time when there's no fighting going on, quite frankly. And they can only do that if they're regular and if they're on the same route. And that's very important. There's also the problem of people who can't travel, like people that are in the hospital that have to have equipment. So they're going to have to bring ambulances up during these pauses and then bring people down that need this kind of assistance. It's very difficult, and it also does rely on Hamas to honor these agreements. And that is something that I don't think a lot of people have confidence in, although nobody's really talking about that. They're demanding a ceasefire on the side of the IDF, and they're not even talking about whether Hamas will honor that or continuously try to exploit the IDF's ceasefire when they're in strong point in a position that might make them vulnerable, quite frankly.
What about this question of what happens in Gaza once this military offensive does come to an end. And of course, that could be quite some way off. We had a big foreign policy speech from the British Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, last night, saying that the government here is still committed to the two-state solution. That was echoed by senior ministers in Parliament today. We're not hearing much from the United States about what it sees as any kind of long-term solution. And we've had Israel talking about how it may need to remain in control of Gaza for quite some time. I mean, where does the US stand on all of this?
So I've seen, Carol, I've seen statements from the Secretary of State, Secretary Blinken, National Security Advisor Sullivan, that they are not for a long-term occupation of Gaza by the IDF. And that they've talked about the need for some kind of international peacekeeping force that could be acceptable to the Palestinian people and, of course, acceptable to the Israelis. Because if the international community wants to do something that causes to be not the disaster that it is, that's likely going to have to happen. If you don't give the Israelis an alternative to their long-term occupation to prevent Hamas from coming back, then we're not going to have, I think, much to say about the outcome. Because if there's not a group that's willing to go in there and do that, then from the Israelis' perspective, they're going to end up in the same situation. And that's just the interim. After that, I think the U.S. has made it clear that they would expect the Palestinian Authority to be back in charge, governing, providing security long term. But in order to get to that point, there's going to have to be an interim force that can provide the stability and security both for the Palestinian people and for the people of Israel, if it's not going to be the IDF.
But isn't the problem that the people of Gaza who've suffered this horrendous bombing, the humanitarian crisis, the blockade, thousands of civilians have died there, you're going to have a radicalized population, aren't you? I mean, whoever tries to govern that, there is this risk that the terrorists, especially as we know that some of the Hamas leadership seem to be have managed to get out and are in other parts, in other Arab states, that you're going to have a radicalized civilian population and a huge difficulty for whoever does try to administer what's left of Gaza.
Absolutely. And, during the whole global war on terror and the units that I was in, there was always a sign on the wall that, is this operation going to create more terrorists than it takes off the street? And I think that's one of the issues when it comes to how one conducts a war that you have to address. You have to do it in a way that doesn't actually radicalize the entire population because of how you executed the war. And I think that's going to be something that the Israelis have to consider. What they've done is going to have to be recognized, but certainly consider moving forward. Demilitarizing is a different thing. If we can stop the flow of weapons, all from Iran, or most of the most sophisticated coming from Iran, that will help reduce the security pressure. But the radicalization is something that is your actions, certainly, and it's an ideology, and it's very difficult to prevent from happening. But it has to be a force. If there is another force, it has to be a force that understands that and is accepted by the people who live there as an interim until they get their own government with their own security forces.